Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Christy Balraj. I am the one of the regional coordinators in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for Partners Resource Network. And Kim nicely invited me to come and speak with you guys about the ARD process, because I know it can be an overwhelming process to go through if you are just getting a new diagnosis for a child, or even if you are what you would consider a seasoned veteran of the ARD process and going to these meetings, it can still be overwhelming. So just kind of want to walk through it with you, answer any questions that you might have. And you can stop me at any time to answer or to ask questions. But there are little light bulbs that we come up through the presentation where we can stop and do a review, and you can ask your questions then. So you know about Partners Resource Network. We are the parent training and information center for the state of Texas. When IDEA was put into place, there was verbiage that stated that every state needed to have a parent training and information center to help parents. And you can see, looking at this slide, some of the things that we do to support parents, and then also some of the other services that we offer. Our main goal as regional coordinators is to help parents become successful advocates for their kids and strong advocates for their kids. We are always here as a resource to parents, but we want to make sure that the parents are understanding what's going on, and that we really understand informed consent, because I think that's, one of the things that you hear when you're going through an ARD meeting is consent to this, consent to that, and we want that consent to be informed. We also work with youth ages 14 to aging out. As their child turns 14, they become an integral part in their own planning and transition planning. And we want to take some of the skills that we've taught the parents and turn around and transfer those skills and teach those skills to the youth, so that when they get out of high school, whether they go to junior college, four-year college training, technical school, work, or whatever, they understand what their rights are and the things that they can ask for. So those are kind of the things that we do. Today, we will be talking about the ARD process in Texas, and that the ARD, ARD, stands for Admission, Review, and Dismissal. So this is a process where you, in the beginning, are going over evaluations, looking to see if the child qualifies or can be admitted into under the umbrella of special education, and be receiving those special education support and services. We review every year those services and supports to make sure that the child is still being successful. And then eventually, when they age out of the schools and move on to post-secondary, that's where we start talking about dismissal. So that kind of gives you an explanation as to why it's titled what it's titled. The first thing that, parents always instinctively know how to do is how to get help for their school-age child. So depending on how old your child is, as a parent, because we were all in school, that if your child is struggling, the first stop is to talk to the child's teacher, find out what's going on, why are we struggling, what are the issues. And then we also suggest that if the communication isn't working well with the teacher, or you and the teacher are having a hard time, I don't want to say coming to a compromise, but kind of coming to an understanding of what's going on, then obviously you want to move to the principal or the assistant principal. But always start with the teacher, because the teacher is the one that spends more time with your student at school than anyone else. And the teacher is also going to be the one that makes sure and follows up to make sure that your child is receiving all the services that they need or that they're entitled to. Oh, let me back up, because I did forget to, well, I'll say it without backing up. The other thing is, most of the times, if you don't reach out to your student's teacher first, the teacher will be the one that will reach out to you to let you know that they've started seeing some issues, whether it's academic issues or behavioral issues based on what's going on in the classroom. So that first communication could be either way. It could be the school reaching out to the parent or the parent reaching out to the school. Either way, I suggest, coming from my background as a former educator, that the moment you as a parent have any kind of sense that there's a struggle academically or behaviorally, go ahead and reach out to that teacher and start the conversation. Throughout the process and throughout the years as you're attending these ARD meetings, you will get what's called a notice of procedural safeguards. This document is very important. This document is basically, in a nutshell, your rights as a parent of a child with a disability. And you can see on this screen the times when you would be offered the procedural safeguards. Typically, you go to an ARD meeting. If you've ever been to one, you go to an ARD meeting. You're talking to the school's talking with you. Then all of a sudden you get all these papers shoved at you that you have to sign. And then they will tell you that also you're receiving a copy of your procedural safeguards, or sometimes tell you those procedural safeguards before you actually have the meeting. Very rarely have I seen a school that will actually kind of go through those safeguards with you. So if you're not familiar with the procedural safeguards, I encourage you to reach out to me. Let me know. I'll be glad to help walk you through those, or get you in touch with your regional coordinator who can do that, because this document is very important with regard to your child's rights, your child's rights as a youth with a disability. And so, like I said, you can kind of see where the times that you would get them. When you make your initial request for an evaluation, the school should give you one. Every time you have an ARD meeting, which is an annual thing, or it doesn't have to be annual, just every time, they will give you one for sure at every annual meeting. The first time you file a complaint, and that's usually at the state level, not necessarily at the building level, but if you were to file a state complaint or a grievance, then they would send you a copy of those. If there was a disagreement and you were requesting an independent educational evaluation, they would give you a copy of your procedural safeguards. Anytime there's going to be a change in services or a change in placement, and then of course, anytime you as a parent request it, they should provide that one. They should provide that for you. So when we're talking about this full and individual evaluation, and a lot of times what you're going to hear is you're going to hear it called or referred to as an FIE, full and individual evaluation. Now that referral or that request for the FIE can be initiated by the school or by the parent. Or, if your child is working with another professional on the campus, like let's say, your child is already receiving speech on campus or already receiving support for dyslexia on the campus. Any other person that works or is involved in the education of your child can request this evaluation. Now, the one thing I will say is make sure you request this evaluation in writing. And typically when parents ask me about requesting it, I will tell them to make sure that they include the principal and assistant principal that works with their child, and whether the school uses a diagnostician or a school psychologist on the campus, the email needs to go to them. The beautiful thing about email is, of course, it's written, but it also has a time and date stamp on there, because that's going to become important when you're talking about evaluation, in that once you request that evaluation, a timeline starts. So the school has, I think, 15 days to respond back to that, saying yes, they're going to evaluate your child, or no, and it has to be written as to why. And then once you sign that parental consent, if the school does agree to, there does need to be an evaluation, and the school sends you that parental consent, which is the second bullet there, as soon as you sign it and return it, then we have another time clock ticking, and that the school has 45 school days from that point to complete the evaluation. and then another 30 days to get their report together, and then get the ARD meeting put together to go over all of that. And because of Child Find and because of IDEA, you know, you want to make sure that that FIE is being, the evaluation is being given, or in all areas of a suspected disability. So if you have a strong disability that, a strong concern that your child might be struggling academically in math, you might want to have them, look specifically at something related to math. If you don't think if your child is not having an issue with the behavior, then we may not necessarily want to look at the behavior component of an evaluation. We may want to just focus on the academic component of the evaluation. So when you submit that initial request for evaluation, we want to make sure we specify what areas we feel like there needs to be an evaluation. And like I said, it should be in writing. Prior written notice. You remember just a minute ago when I said you requested the evaluation and then the school has 15 days to respond. Well, that response, whether it's a yes, we're going to evaluate, or a no, we're not going to evaluate, is going to come in the form of this prior written notice. So at the top of the slide, when it says prior written notice is required when the school proposes or refuses to initiate or change, and then you have your 5 bullets underneath there. So it can't just be you request this evaluation and you get an email back with the word no on it. There has to be a paperwork filled out. There has to be an explanation. There's all kinds of information that's included in this prior written notice. And this doesn't necessarily have to pertain just to the evaluation. If you were requesting like maybe a one-to-one, or requesting something that's going to require a change to the plan that's already in place, that prior written notice, you will see that form there too. And it also lets you know, it gives you good information because it's giving you an explanation as to why the school is saying yes or the school is saying no. And of course, that very last statement at the bottom of the slide includes a change prompted by parental revocation of consent. So at any time, you've started through this consent and the evaluation, if you as a parent decide, you know what, I don't want to do this, we're not going to do this anymore, you have the right to revoke that consent. And that's kind of what it's talking about in there. You have the right to revoke your consent at any time. So here we go. It was a good segue leading into parental consent. So before the school can do that initial evaluation, or when it comes time for the 3-year reevaluation, the school has to get parental consent from you. And that's where I always like to put the word informed in front of that, because when I was in education, we always talked about with the ARD committees and the parents, informed parental consent. So that word informed is very key. You need to know exactly what you're giving consent to. There shouldn't be a time when you sign a consent for the school to do any kind of evaluation of your child and you not understand exactly what's going on. And this is very important for our Spanish speaking parents. Please understand that the school has a duty to, exhaust all options to provide forms, meetings, anything that they send to you in your native language. So don't be intimidated about asking. Don't feel like, well, I can't ask for this, because you absolutely can. That's one of the things that's listed in that notice of procedural safeguards that parents need to be informed about, that you can say, no, I don't want to have a meeting, or no, I can't have this meeting because I need an interpreter or a translator, and you need to provide that for me. And the school has to exhaust every effort to do that. So here's our first light bulb. Any questions that anybody might have so far about what we're going over? I feel like I'm going really quickly.
Sarah had one in the chat. She said, I heard that some school districts get around the timeline by scheduling an ARD and then rescheduling.
I've not ever really heard of that. It wouldn't surprise me if that's something that they do. But here's the thing. They only have, once that evaluation is complete and completed after 45 days, they only have a 30-day window to write their report and meet with the parents before they're out of compliance. And trust me, the district level special education director or coordinator or whoever will be the first one to get on the diagnostician or the school psychologist if that ARD is not in compliance. So if you feel like that they're rescheduling and rescheduling and rescheduling, and it's gonna, get past those 30 days, then I suggest you reach out to us, reach out to me, and I can put you in contact with your regional coordinator, and we can help you navigate through that, because they've only got those 30 days, and then after those 30 days, it's considered being in. I hope that answered your question, Sarah. Is there anything else in it? I don't see anything else in there.
If nobody has any other questions, if you guys could go ahead and mute yourselves. And she will continue.
I will keep rolling. Okay, so we talked about the initial, getting information from the teacher or talking to the teacher if you have concern about what's going on in the classroom, or if you feel like your child is struggling academically or behaviorally. So let's say that you've done that, because in a perfect world, the way it should work, you have your child, they're struggling, the teacher is using interventions in class to address the academic deficits or behavior deficits, or both, whichever one it might be. And so they're working those interventions, keeping in contact with you, keeping in contact with other school personnel to make sure that we're trying to gain progress for that child. So now we get to a point, we realize those interventions aren't working like they're supposed to, so we request the evaluation. So the evaluation is completed. Now we're in that 30-day window. You know what? I'm gonna move outside, Kim, because I can tell this hammering is getting loud. And I apologize, guys. They're here laying carpet in my house, so I'm gonna move outside where it's a little bit quieter. So we are at the point now where you have requested that evaluation and the school has done the evaluation and we're coming to our meeting. Well, in order to determine if your child is gonna be eligible to receive the special education service and supports, the first thing that's the most important is there has to be a disability there. And if you go back to IDEA, in IDEA, there are a list, I think, of 13 disabilities that IDEA considers a disability that would need special education support and services. So first thing you must have is a disability. And then the second criteria for getting services, special education support and services, is that as a result of whatever that disability is, that the extra services and supports that can be given to your child through special education would be a benefit for them, or they're not going to be able to be successful in the classroom without those services and supports. So it's a two-pronged thing. It's the diagnosis or the disability, plus that disability causing a strong enough student need for academics. Now, I have had academic support. I have had parents tell me that schools will say, well, your child is doing really great on their grades, so we don't think they qualify for special education support and services. Special education support and services has nothing to do with the grades of your child. So if the school says, your child is doing fine, we don't think they need this, then my response to them back is, well, just imagine how much better they would be doing if they were getting these supports and services. Or when they get older and the material gets to be a little more, you make that transition from learning to read to reading to learn, then, you know, those services might be a little bit more beneficial then. So that's basically the two-prong criteria for receiving special education support and services. And the one thing I like to also remind parents is special education is not a place. When I was in school and the first part of my teaching career, special education was kind of looked at as a place. It was a room where kids would go when they needed extra support and when they needed extra help. It's not viewed that way anymore. Special education is looked at as being a set of supports and services to be implemented in the least restrictive environment as possible to help that child be successful. So I always kind of like to clarify that when we're talking about this, we're really talking about services and supports that can be put in place to help the child be successful. So now let's talk about those ARD committee meetings. They have to be held at least once a year. And we do that because we want to make sure that our students are making progress. And so we check that progress once a year. Now, one thing you need to know as a parent, you have a right to call an ARD meeting anytime you want. If you notice your child's not making progress on their goals, or you start to notice that we're having some behavior issues, or you start to notice that your child is kind of leveling out their grades at school, they don't seem to be progressing, they're not going backwards, but they're not really progressing forwards, then we want to make sure that we call an ARD meeting. If you have any questions or concerns, then you as a parent of a child with disabilities have a right to call an ARD meeting at any time. And the school cannot refuse that. They cannot say, oh, well, they're doing fine, we think we need to have a meeting. They have to comply and go ahead and set up the time for that meeting. And you can see some of the bullets under there that let you know some of the possible reasons why you might want to call an ARD meeting outside of the annual ARD meeting. And the one thing I also like to remind people of is when you're talking about this ARD committee, this is a committee of professionals who have come together in agreement to work towards helping this child be successful. This is a voluntary thing. It's not a requirement. You know, it's something that they've agreed to do because it's something that needs to be done. And so we just need to remember that we're all on the same team, that it's not school versus parent, parent versus school. We're all on the same team working towards trying to see the child be successful. So when you talk about the actual members of the committee, you have the parents first and foremost. And to me, the parents are the number one person in the meeting because they have more information about their child and they have information about their child from a different context than what the teachers might have. Because, you know, school is, for the most part, structured. Home is not necessarily structured as much as school. Of course, that depends on, you know, your home and your child's level of disability, but there's usually a difference in the areas. So what you have is you have two discrete pieces of information that are different enough to provide good information to the ARD committee. So parents are number one, in my opinion, when it comes to membership on the committee, because parents' input is very valuable. No one knows your child like you do. You have to have at least one regular education and one special education teacher. Now, the one caveat I have to that is if you have a child that's in the upper elementary and middle school or high school grades, if that child is seeing different teachers for different subjects, I would say requesting the regular education teacher to come to the meeting in the class that your child struggles with the most. So if your child has dyslexia or is struggling with the reading and the writing part, then request that ELA teacher be there. If your child struggles in the math class, then suggest or request that math teacher be the regular education teacher there. Too many times I've been to ARD meetings where, you know, the child might be struggling in one content area, but they bring a teacher who the child's not struggling in. And so you're not getting a full picture or being able to have that rich conversation as you would if you were talking to the teacher of the class where the child is struggling. Then you've got a representative of the district, and that's typically your principal or your assistant principal. Sometimes you might have a special education coordinator, you might have the special education director if there's issues, but typically it's going to be your principal or your assistant principal. You're going to have someone that can interpret the instructional implications of the evaluation results, and that's typically going to be your diagnostician. Some schools, the district where I worked, I had an LSSP that was the licensed specialist in school psychology that was assigned to my campus. And he was the one that ran, well, he didn't run the ARDs, but he was that person that was able to interpret those evaluation results. So depending on the district, it could be a diagnostician, it could be a school psychologist. The student, I would say if your student is comfortable being there, and you feel like your student is old enough to understand what's going on in the process, that as soon as that happens, they should be there. Whether that's, 8 years old, 9 years old, 14 years old, I think the student needs to be involved in the conversation as much as possible. I don't think the student needs to be there for the whole entire meeting, but I do think the student needs to be there to give input into, how they feel like things are going in class. Because like I said, that's valuable information that can be used. And then when it's talking about other individuals, that could be, me if I'm your regional coordinator or the regional coordinator in your area. You could have, if your child is getting speech services outside of school, you could have your child's speech therapist. You could have your child's psychiatrist, psychologist, medical doctor, any other person that you want to bring to that meeting, whether they have information to provide about your child or they're just there as moral support and an extra set of eyes or ears. That's your right as a parent to be able to have those people there. If the school district can invite multiple people because they're considered a resource for the committee, then you can do the same thing. So you are, as a parent, are entitled to have other individuals attend the meeting if you want them to. And the ARD scheduling, the meeting scheduling. This is another thing that's in your procedural safeguards that's very important. The parents have to be invited to the ARD meeting. And they have to be given at least 5 school days notice prior to the meeting. Sometimes, if it's an emergency, the parents can say, I don't care about the 5 school days. Let's go ahead and let's get this meeting on the books. And that can happen. But the most important thing that I find that parents have the hardest time pushing back on the school with is that third bullet, making sure that the time and place is agreeable to the parents and the school. I know typically you'll get an invitation saying, hey, the school wants to have an ARD meeting on February 16th at 9:30. And parents think, oh my gosh, I have to shuffle my schedule. No, you don't. If that time and place doesn't work for you, then send an email back saying, I can't attend on that date. However, here are some dates that I am available. Please let me know, because this has to be at a time and a place that's agreeable to both. There are situations, that last bullet, there are extenuating situations where an ARD meeting can be held without a parent. But when I say extenuating, I mean extenuating. And there's a lot of things that the school would have to do to have that meeting without the parent being there. So when we look at the responsibilities of this committee, now remember, this is a committee of professionals who have come together and agreed to work for putting in supports and services to help this child. So the first thing we want to look at is we want to look at the strengths of the student. A lot of times when you go to ARD meetings, you hear a lot about what the kiddos can't do. Well, they can't do this and they can't do this and they can't do this. But we need to look at the flip side of that, because what are some of the things that they're being successful with? And then how are they being successful? Do they highlight when they are in their social studies class, and that's how they can remember all this stuff? I mean, what are the things that the students doing that are making them successful in one place and not in another? Or if their strengths are in math, then what strengths in math can we use to transfer into helping them be successful in science? So we always want to look at the strengths as well as the weaknesses. Any concerns that a parent might have definitely need to be brought up at the committee, to the committee, and discussed. If there's been any recent evaluations, even if it's from an outside evaluation, like if you have your child doing outside speech and the speech language pathologist did an evaluation and you want that information included, bring it so it can be included. You always want to look at the academic, developmental, and functional needs of a student. And then the present levels, because the way this works is the schools and the parents talk about the present levels of where the child is. You know, are they doing well in this class? Are they not doing well? What are the present levels? Then those present levels should help create the goals. Because if they're struggling on something, we want to create a goal to address that area of struggle. So the present levels help create the goals. And we'll talk about goals in just a second. And then the goals in turn help us decide what services and supports we need, and then what's the best place to implement those services and supports. So the present levels are very, very important, especially, you know, depending on the disability. If you're talking about a child where we're only looking at the functional performance versus academic, we definitely want to know those present levels. And if your child's disability is not severe, you still want to look at those functional performances, because, you know, once they get out of school, once they're having to do things on their own at some point, what areas in that functional world do they need to have work on now so that they'll be able to, you know, live on their own to whatever degree is possible. So we're now at our second light bulb. Any questions, concerns, issues that we've had about what we've talked about so far? I know this is like everything else with regards to special education. It's a lot of information. So I want to make sure I address your concerns as much as possible. So now that we've gotten the evaluation, we know who's supposed to be there, we know what they're supposed to be working on. Let's look at what the responsibilities are of the committee. So I told you a few minutes ago that we were going to be talking about goals. There it is in that first bullet there. Develop measurable annual goals designed to meet the students' needs. And when I look at IEPs, which is that individualized education plan, when I look at IEPs and I'm going over them with parents, underneath those goals, it would always be nice to see some kind of a benchmark. So in other words, those goals might say, in 36 weeks, Christy will be able to count from 1 to 50 successfully 80% of the time with two out of 3 trials. And that would be over a year. Well, I would like to see in 6 weeks, we expect her to be this far. In 12 weeks, we expect her to be this far. In 24 weeks, we expect her to be this far. That way we know if you're making progress towards your goals. So, you know, you kind of like to see those benchmarks underneath there. You also want to look at what accommodations need to be put in place for the child to have success in the classroom and on those mandatory state assessments. So that's where we look at those accommodations. Those accommodations can be something from as simple as, you know, frequent reminders to stay on task, to, you know, having a test read out loud to them, shortening assignments. I mean, if you Google accommodations, you're going to come up with a million different sources and a million different accommodations, and you could go down that rabbit hole and stay gone for several days, because there's just a ton of accommodations. But the key here is not to have like a shotgun blast of 50 accommodations, but to pick the ones that you feel like are really going to be the most bang for your buck when you're talking about accommodations. And remember, accommodations can always be changed. So if you choose one and it doesn't work, then we change it and we try something else. So just because we identify it doesn't mean it stays there forever. Then we want to look at those supplementary aids and services. Supplementary aids could be, you know, assistive technology devices. Depending on the disability, you might want to have, you know, a supplementary aid could be having a picture schedule. Supplementary services and related services could be speech, OT, PT, transportation could be considered a related service. Student nutrition and nurses could, and the health related services could all be related, because if your child has a specific diet, that's going to be a related service. So those are all things that are going to be looked at. And then supplemental areas for students with autism. So Texas has what they call the autism supplement. And the autism supplement are 11 items that you should go through every time you have an ARD meeting and discuss those 11 items and see if those are things that need to be put in place for your child with autism. And we have a whole separate training on that one. So yeah, if that's something that you want more information about, you can reach out to me and I'll be glad to discuss it with you. But another supplemental area could be ESY when you're talking about that extended school year. So those are all things that you want to have out on the table to discuss when you're with the ARD committee. So you continue, and here's the ESY that I mentioned. So you continue discussing whether the student's going to qualify for the extended school year. And typically that revolves around the fact that if your student is out for Christmas vacation, spring break, Thanksgiving, and they come back and you see that they've regressed or they've lost progress, then we want to look at that ESY as a potential at the end of the school year. It's not summer school. It's to help them from regressing on their goals. So if you are going through the year and you find out that your child is not progressing on their goals, or at the end of the year does not master one of the goals, then ESY needs to be a topic of conversation. Because if they're not mastering that goal, they are making progress, but they're not mastering, then that tells us we need some extended time to do that. And so we want to make sure that that's always a possibility. The ARD committee's responsibility is to make sure that your child is being educated in the least restrictive environment. Least restrictive environment is going to look different for every child. But we want to always make sure that we're doing things where the kiddos are being educated with their non-disabled peers as much as possible in that least restrictive environment. And then as your child gets older, you want to look at the graduation criteria, because every child with a disability's graduation plan is going to be a little bit different. So we want to make sure that we're always looking ahead to what's graduation going to look like, and then what's life after graduation going to look like. This is the one where we always have problems when you start talking about discipline. The student code of conduct that every district has is going to apply to all students. Now, there are limitations, like it says here on the slide. There are limitations, certain limitations and rules when we're talking about the student code of conduct in a student with disabilities. And typically, you're going to run into these situations. Hopefully, prior to there being an issue, you have already noticed that there are some behavior issues. We have already, talked with the ARD committee about requesting that functional behavior assessment, or we have a behavior intervention plan in place. So hopefully we're not getting to a situation where, we have an extreme situation and we've got to start talking about current placement for a child. Because, obviously we don't want to change placement for a child if we don't have to. We want to try to keep things as steady as possible. But there may be times when you have to talk about a change of placement with regards to discipline. And typically, if you have a student who brings a weapon to school, brings drugs to school, some of those really egregious offenses, then you're going to be discussing a change of placement, and there's not going to be a whole lot of room for, I don't want to say negotiation, but there's not going to be a whole lot of wiggle room there. Now, if you're talking about a child who gets put in-house suspension, one day for, refusing to work, and another day for being disrespectful, and maybe another day for skipping class. You're talking about little issues that come up every now and then what you want to keep in mind is once you get close to that 10 days, and it doesn't have to be 10 days in a row, but any 10 days out of the school year where your child is out of their current placement, then we want to start looking at having an ARD meeting to discuss, one, why are we having these issues? And two, if we don't have a functional behavior assessment or a behavior intervention plan put in place, then we need to go ahead and do that. Because behavior is a form of communication. Typically what happens is you have a child who has some kind of need that's not being met. They don't know how to verbalize it or vocalize it. So they take the path of least resistance to get attention, which is going to be behavior. And if we don't meet that need, then that behavior is going to continue to be there. So we need to find out through that functional behavior assessment, what function is this behavior serving? And that's kind of how it gets its name. What function is that behavior serving? And so once that 10 days is that magic number. So if your child is being out of class, in the office, in ISS, and we're approaching that 10-day mark or even suspension, and we're approaching 10 days out of placement, you need to get in touch with the ARD committee and say, look, we need to get together and meet. And I know we've got a whole nother training on discipline too, because that is definitely a rabbit hole that you could go down with a million scenarios. When you call the ARD meeting because of the 10 days out of placement, this is called the manifestation determination. They call it a manifestation and determination review typically. And so what you're looking at is you are looking at a behavior. And you are looking at that behavior and trying to determine what causes it and how do we work to try to correct it and to teach replacement behaviors. And you will have this also if your child is to the point where they're talking about putting them in an alternative educational setting because of behavior, because of something that's happened at school. They still have to have that manifestation and determination review. And that's a good thing because if you do already have a BIP or a behavior intervention plan in place and you're still having behavior issues, that BIP needs to be revised. And so going back through this manifestation and determination review gives the ARD committee the opportunity to look at that behavior intervention plan and start making changes so that hopefully we're not dealing with that second bullet there of them having to be put into an alternative education setting. So then when we talk about ARD committees and ARD committee meetings, when you're working with a group of people, there's always going to be the possibility of there being a disagreements over you disagree with an evaluation, you disagree with the services, you disagree with where the services are being offered. So we always talk about that dispute resolution. So here are 4 situations or 4 ways to try to resolve that dispute. Facilitated IEP, mediation, complaint, and due process. Those are all done in conjunction with personnel from TEA. TEA will send in someone who's been trained in facilitating the facilitated IEP, who's trained in mediation to try to get that resolution between the 2 parties. I'm going to be honest with you. I've had several parents who now are to the point of they're tired of hearing COVID as an excuse. They're tired of hearing excuses and they're skipping everything and going straight to a state complaint, which is your right as a parent to do that. You don't have to try to work it out with the school district. You can go straight to a state complaint. I don't know. I've never been involved with one, so I'm not sure how the whole process works. But no, as a parent of a child with a disability, you have the right to do those things. And then the due process hearing is, I think, the pinnacle of the dispute resolution. I know when you talk about complaint and you talk about due process hearing, then that's where you're talking about having to have attorneys. It can get expensive. You're then talking about more of, especially in that due process hearing, You are there talking more about it being in a more of a courtroom type setting where you have somebody that listens, and whatever comes out of that due process hearing is a legal and binding document. And so, yeah, that the last two, the complaint and the due process hearing, those are more legal, where you would have to have an attorney helping you. So when you have an ARD meeting, what should you expect? Here's pretty much your ARD agenda. School will always do the introductions and talk about procedural safeguards, you know, depending on if it's the first ARD meeting or if it's the annual ARD meeting, they'll always tell you, we've sent them to you, or here they are. And then you go through and you start looking at the important parts of the ARD meeting, reviewing any assessment data, whether you've had a new evaluation or whether this is just a reevaluation. Always going back over the determination of eligibility to make sure something hasn't changed. Because, you know, things happen where, you know, kids are listed as their disability as being, let's say, OHI, other health impairment for something. And then throughout the course of time, we might get another disability that's identified that we want to add to that. So that's kind of where that determination of eligibility comes in. You might want to add another disability in there because it might warrant that extra attention from the ARD committee. Then this is your PLAF. You'll hear it referred to as a PLAF. Those are the present levels. Sometimes you'll just hear the diagnostician or someone say, okay, let's talk about Christy's present levels, or let's review the PLAF. And it's the same thing. The present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. And then this is where you would be getting feedback on goals, how they're doing, how your child's doing on the goals, because that's where they are at the present time. Then you would look at the review and development of the IEP. So you're going to take the information from the PLAF, you're going to incorporate and look at the new goals. So the new goals should reflect the present levels. And then the new goals are going to we're going to be talking about what are those accommodations that we might need. And that's where it's all a part of that review and development of the IEP. That's where we're talking about the present levels. We're talking about the goals. We're talking about the accommodations. We're talking about the services that might be needed to be provided for the child. And then we move down into that last bullet, determination of placement. Where is all of this going to be taking place? And this is where we keep in mind that least restrictive environment, making sure that your child is being afforded that least restrictive environment. They're being afforded the opportunity to be with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. And also in the midst of all that, if your child is of the age to be taking the standardized testing, then they're going to talk about that and the accommodations for the standardized testing. That second to the last bullet, assurances and reading of the minutes. Depending on the ARD meeting, depending on what's being discussed, I always strongly suggest to my parents to make sure they have those minutes or those deliberations read back. Because if and when your child is in a new school or a new teacher needs to be working with your child, they're going to look at that IEP. And one of the things they're going to look at is they're going to look at those minutes, because the minutes are going to give a summary of what was discussed. So I always suggest that parents have those deliberations and those minutes read back, because we want to make sure that what we discussed is accurately being reflected in the minutes of the meeting. And then, of course, you talk about the closing, you do the closing remarks and the signatures. When we get to the closing remarks and the signatures, that's usually where they say, okay, do you, mom, dad, do you agree with what we've talked about here and agree with everything that the ARD committee has put together? And this is where you would typically sign and check agree or disagree. I always suggest to parents, because they also talk about a 5-day waiting period. I always suggest to parents that at this point in the ARD meeting, they're going to say, you've got 5 days that you can wait before the new services and the new accommodations are started, or you can waive that 5-day period and start the new accommodations and new services as soon as possible. I always suggest to my parents to take those 5 days, go back over the document, because you can request a draft copy of everything that y'all just discussed. Go back over that, read through it again, make sure it's got everything in there that you're wanting before you sign and agree. Because it's very important to make sure that you understand exactly what's in there, and that what's in there is exactly what you guys discussed during that meeting. So I always suggest that parents take that 5 days, read through it, get with me if I'm the regional coordinator, or get with their regional coordinator to go over it. And then once you are done and you say, yes, this is what I want, sign it, check agree, send it back to the school with your child, or send it back through email. It's just always a good thing to make sure, because I honestly don't believe people do make mistakes and omit things on purpose. I think the poor diagnostician is doing her best to keep up with what's going on and typing the notes and doing everything. Sometimes things just get left out. So it's always good to make sure you go back and preview it, or review it, I'm sorry. Because this IEP is a legal and binding document. You wouldn't sign the mortgage on the home or sign, loan papers without reading through them. So, I kind of always equate it to that. Making sure you know exactly what you're agreeing to. And this brings us to the end. So I wanted to let you guys know we have some websites here. Our website, unfortunately, has not been corrected. That's not our correct web address. It's prntexas.org. The other ones are correct, but these are good websites that we will refer our parents to for more information. I will give you one caveat with Wright's Law. Wright's Law is a great website. It's very legal, so it can be kind of hard to navigate, but that's one of the things that we are here to help parents with if necessary. And then also it gives you some more information about how this webinar was made available by information from TEA and other stakeholders throughout the state. And here's the information for our general website and our statewide office. But if you want direct access to your regional coordinator, it's easier just to shoot me an email and I can get you in touch with them than to go through the statewide website and the state phone number. So
Brittany had a question. She said, are there any particular school districts that do a good job with IEPs, inclusion of students with disabilities?
It might be easier for me to say the ones that don't do a good job.
That might
and
be
unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to say that. I find that how can I say this? I find that there are some districts that do better jobs than others. But even in the districts that struggle, you're going to see a school in that struggling district who does a really good job over here. And then another school does a really good job in that same district. And then you might have a school that doesn't do a very good job. So really and truly, it really comes down to the individual school building. Now, I mean, if you wanted to have a conversation off the record where I'm not being recorded, I can be glad to give you information in the Dallas and Fort Worth area. If you have specific questions, then I can answer that as much as possible. But just like with anything else, you're going to find some areas where it's great, and you're going to find some areas where it's become a perfect storm for horribleness because that's just kind of the way it goes. And so one of the things that I try to do, and my other regional coordinators try to do, is we try to also work with the school and work with the special education department at the district level to point out, hey, you got some great people doing great things over here, spread the wealth, because over here we're suffering a little. And we try to do that as tactfully as possible. And I know that was kind of a politically correct way to answer that question.
I will, Brittany, I will forward Christie's contact information as far as her email is. Is that your email on there, the Partners Resource SBC Global?
No, Brittany, there's my phone number, my work number.
What is your email? And I'll type it in the
I'm
chat.
putting it in there right now.
Oh, okay.
And you know what? I'm going to say, Kim, I meant to tell you this earlier. You're not the first person in the last 2 weeks that has told me my email has started going to their junk folders
Yeah.
or to their spam. I think
We've
because my
emailed-
email is so generic
Oh.
that new filters, I guess, maybe have started kicking it into their spam folders.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, and
Well,
Brittany,
Brittany, I hope,
I would say it helps a lot to talk to other parents
Yeah.
who have kids in the school district, because she is 100% correct that you can have one school up the road that's doing a fantastic job, and a block away, the school's not doing the greatest job. So talking to parents, if you're not in the DFW Down Syndrome Family Facebook page, that's a great place to go and just shoot a question out, and you will get immediate responses from hundreds of parents who are walking that walk. And it's good to hear that. But Christy will, you can reach out to Christy after this is done and chat with her, because she has firsthand experience. Well, Christy, I appreciate you being here today and joining us.
Thanks, Kim. I always enjoy presenting to your people.
As few as there were today. Well, we appreciate it, and we will be in touch.
All right, great. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thanks, you too.